Welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz.
Welcome back. I want to thank everyone for accommodating us, making a time in their schedule to meet with us. And if you haven't figured it out, that's the topic of today. I could not think of a better way to segue into that. Accommodations.
Love it.
Ways that the MCAT can help you with what you need to take the MCAT effectively. I've had a lot of students with accommodations over the years, and it is a very weird process to go through for a lot of students, and very lots of hoops to jump through and lots of things to clarify. A lot of times students don't know that they would qualify for accommodations or that they even should be reaching out, or sometimes people think that they should get accommodations for things and then they don't get those. So we wanted to kind of clarify some of that today because it is a big process. It's a little bit messy. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and it takes a lot of work on your end as the student. This is a conversation I've been having with my foster kids. Is listen, sometimes systems are not set up to make it easy for you, and you have to be the squeaky wheel, kind of driving things forward. And I feel like this is a perfect example of this, where a lot of this should be easier, but whether or not it should or shouldn't doesn't matter. You have to be the driving force for a lot of this. So definitely there's a lot to talk about here because there's a lot of stuff going on with accommodations.
Phil, you hit a pressure point for me in the sense that, you know this, and if folks who are listening have been to a free trial session in the last couple of months may have heard, I paused med school this year to do a master's in public health. And so much of what we talk about are structural barriers, and the way that systems the way that they're created are almost designed to cause issues. The systems work the way they are meant to. Unfortunately,
quote unquote.
Yeah, exactly. Work. And they often spew out inequities, right? And this is a situation where, like you pointed out, it falls on students to really be the drivers of getting the support and the accommodations that they need. And so it becomes really important to think about this very early on. And we know that students have started signing up for dates. And so this becomes even more important of a conversation. And so these accommodations, like you pointed out, are ways that the AMC will try to work with students in order to make taking the exam a more equitable process, and making sure that people are, on a level playing field, depending on what their individual needs might be. And so there are a lot of different versions of this, but something that before we even start talking about that is really important to bring up is the cost. And so this can be a very expensive process because there will be a lot of documentation that needs to happen to, like you point out, be that squeaky wheel and convince the AMC that you truly need these accommodations. And so this can put, folks in a place of financial hardship and difficulty. One of the ways that the AMC tries to offset this is for folks that are granted the fee assistance program. And if anyone's listening and has not looked into that, it's another way that the AMC tries to help folks out and make it slightly more equitable process is if folks meet their income cutoff, then they get reduced costs on signing up for the exam, access to the AMC practice materials for free, and some help with the actual application process. But with respect to accommodations, if folks have, the fee assistance program and need to get evaluations done or reevaluations, the AMC provides a certain amount of funding to help offset those costs because it can be a very expensive process. And so we want to make sure to bring that up so that it's on folks' radar. It's a really important thing to keep in mind with this.
Yeah. And being aware of that, kind of saying being the squeaky wheel, it's not just you being the squeaky wheel, it's you bringing in a wall of backing to you. Like, it's not just me saying, I need this, and so you need to give it to me, but like, I have letters from lots of different places kind of like going in. And so that also makes it difficult because you have to be the one to do that. And so you want to be thinking about this early and really kind of like being that driving force. But as you mentioned, sometimes it can be really expensive because you need letters from ophthalmologists or letters from physicians, or you need to get new psychiatric evaluations because the old ones don't like hit the criteria of what the AMC expects. And so don't expect that you can just kind of like you have accommodations at your school, and so you can go and talk to your counselor and get your letter that they say they give you accommodations. Like, that's not going to be enough for the AAMC. And so you definitely want to kind of be aware of that. And the accommodations vary wildly on the sort of things that they can kind of give you for those accommodations, whether they just like can give you a moment to just kind of like pause the test for a moment and kind of like, recenter yourself, I guess, versus taking the exam over multiple days, having like different like physical accommodations, like what stuff can you bring into the test room, like that can change and alter. And so all this is stuff that you want to be kind of on top of going into this.
Yeah. And like we mentioned, right, there can be reevaluations, there can be a lot of variation. And it's important to note that this is done on an individual basis. So just because someone you know with a condition got X accommodation doesn't mean that you'll get X accommodation. And so it's not just by condition, it's by how much it affects your ability to take the test under standard conditions. And with the conversation of difficulty and documentation, that wall that you brought up, if you have gotten accommodations in the past, they do require that you let them know of what those accommodations are. But again, it may not be the same. And so keeping that in mind, really important. There are a lot of different things that you can get accommodations for. And I want to point out that your need for accommodations can change, right? So you might not need accommodations at this point in time, but something might come up, something might develop that will ultimately require, or you would benefit from accommodations. And so just because you don't apply right away or you don't need them in this moment doesn't mean that they shouldn't be on your radar. And so I think this podcast episode is still worth listening to for folks that in the moment may not think that they need accommodations. So I know, some of the folks might have dropped off by now, but I do think it's really valuable to take a listen.
Yeah, I agree. I did not get accommodations for my test, but I actually have, turns out, multiple conditions that would have qualified for accommodations, which would have made my test day experience easier. And so absolutely. And I think that happens for a lot of people. So it's one of those reasons you want to be aware of it. We're going to talk about this kind of at the end, I think, is like the timeline side of this, but I also really want to emphasize, like, we're going to talk about like specific conditions and things like that, and what kind of those accommodations would look like. But also the timeline is really important. And so I want you to kind of pay attention to that, because there's a lot of times students say like, oh, I fit all these criteria. I have these things. I have all the paperwork. You still might not be able to get accommodations if you are not fast enough on your timeline. Because this is something that can take multiple months. And you should expect it to take multiple months at the minimum for you to be able to kind of get into that. That's not even you getting all that paperwork, right? After you get the paperwork and you submit it, you should plan on it taking multiple months even after that to get approved for those accommodations.
Yeah. So some of the classic things that people might realize, accommodations would be beneficial, are for difficulty differences in learning, so often called learning disabilities. You can imagine that a situation where a student has dyslexia, right? That accommodations would be really important in making sure that they can take the test and get the score that they have the potential to get. And so these are some of the classic things that we might think about. And so for situations like that, right, time may be a really important component, and that can be one of the ways that the AMC can accommodate folks with differences in learning. That said, I've definitely heard of situations where people don't realize that they have a learning difficulty until later on in their academic career and whatnot. And so if it's something that has come up in conversation with a teacher, an instructor in the past about the possibility of that, but even if you haven't had, formal testing, if that's something that is within your means and there's, a little bit more of a higher suspicion, it's come up in conversation a couple of times, it might be worth looking into that. And so I just want to point that out because a lot of times, people have these suspicions, but they're not confirmed. And like you pointed out, you might be eligible for accommodations and might really benefit from them, but just not know. And I know that you and I have definitely talked about this, but med school is a time where a lot of conditions kind of show themselves because of the stress and the intensity. And so that's why I think if it's come up in conversation a couple of times with teachers and instructors, worth doing a little bit more digging into that.
Yeah. If you had asked me, like, when I took the MCAT or even like the year after that, like, do I have anything? I would have said no. Like, no, there's nothing. And like, there are people who've said like, man, it's hard to get Phil to pay attention to some stuff sometimes. And like that is, and like, oh, he's just bored, and things like that. And like those things came up a lot when I was younger. And so I do have ADHD and I've been kind of diagnosed with that now, but that didn't happen until I was in med school. And that's because it didn't cause problems until I was in med school. But there were signs and stuff kind of earlier than that. And so I should have like pursued that a little bit more aggressively. It's hard though, because a lot of times people don't get that support. This is a big meta discussion. Actually, this is like, let's step away from MCAT accommodations for a second. People often don't pursue like, I need help with this, like whatever it is, until it's a problem. And then they feel overwhelmed. And like you don't want to be like dealing with like, oh, I need to figure out how to manage my ADHD at the same time as I am in the middle of medical school the first semester and I am being overwhelmed and being stomped by that. Because it's a lot of things to deal with going in that. Like med school, even if you are like completely neurotypical and you have no other issues outside, like you go home from class and you sit in a white room and there's nothing else going on in your life, which is, I guess, would be a problem. But if there's no other things, like that's still a really hard like thing to do. And so adding other things on top of that is important. But you also mentioned, like, I feel like kind of in that same thing, ADHD kind of comes up in that. But you were talking about how like it's useful for students to be aware of this. I actually have had a student in the actually two students in the last year that have gotten concussions, like while they were studying for the MCAT and kind of like going through this. And then those concussions, one of them ended up creating like actually like differences in processing speeds. And so because of that concussion, even like 8 months later, like they were like just kind of processing things a little bit slower going through. They're still able to figure everything out. They just kind of needed a little bit more time going through that. And so note that this doesn't have to be like a chronic lifelong psychiatric condition. Like it could be just like I'm going through PTSD, right? Like I just found out that like my family's house burned down and my parents are getting a divorce, and that happened all of a sudden. Like that's not like something. I want to be careful with this. I want to say that's not something that's wrong with you, but your life is kind of like building around that and kind of creating problems. But I feel like that implies that if you have ADHD or depression or dyslexia, that there's something wrong with you. And I don't want to imply that either.
No.
But like having this idea, I think a lot of times people feel like it's a problem with myself. And that's a big issue with like psychiatric conditions, just kind of overall a lot of the stigma tied to those, which shouldn't be there. I do have ADHD, but sometimes it's a superpower and sometimes it's a detriment. And just understanding that I process things a little bit differently than others is something that is, I think, worth just kind of being aware of. And if you want to be a physician, you really need to be aware of these sorts of things. And so this is something that even if you don't get accommodations, being aware of different conditions and trying to make that work is a useful, important thing. Sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox here. I'm like, there's some like big picture stuff with like the way that society works and the way that humanity works that I have some strong feelings on.
Yeah. And I want to also point out that this is part of why we're changing our language in medicine, right? Rather than defining patients and individuals by the conditions they have, shifting the language. For example, someone who has diabetes versus the diabetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they are still, people are still people outside of the conditions that they're dealing with. And so that shift in language, I think, in the medical field is also important, an important reflection of society's changing perspectives about, medical conditions. And again, our soapboxes, but not to get started on the medicalization of a lot of different things. What constitutes the normal? But these are kind of some of the more typical things that people immediately think of. There are also some that may not immediately come to mind, but are important. So things like vision or hearing impairments. And so folks that, have difficulty seeing, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be physicians, or people that, have difficulty hearing and may need to wear hearing aids doesn't mean that they shouldn't be physicians. And so the AAMC can also provide accommodations for some of these conditions. You can imagine that the accommodations for visual difficulties or impairments would be different than those for hearing, because you're not listening to things in terms of the actual exam on test day. But if you have a hearing aid, the AAMC wants to know about it, because they're going to have to check to make sure that this is not some form of, device that has information stored on it, or, communication. And basically as a way to make sure that the people that are wearing what appear to be hearing aids actually are hearing aids. And so this is a way to make sure that those folks are not at a disadvantage, right?
Yeah.
And so it's important to communicate this with the AAMC. And there can be a lot of different ways that vision impairments are accommodated. And again, this really goes back to that individual basis for how it's assessed and what accommodations the AAMC provides. And so it's important to start that process very early, have clear documentation. You mentioned ophthalmologists before. Just really important to keep track of these things. And again, may not have initially thought about this. As a heads up, glasses are examined every time you go in and out of the testing center. This applies not just for the MCAT, but also when you get into medical school and are taking standardized exams and national exams. Same thing is going to happen. And so this process, while we're discussing it in the context of the MCAT, also applies once you're in medical school, applies to the standardized exams that you take in medical school. I developed chronic conditions while I was in medical school, and so I did not get accommodations on the MCAT because these conditions had not come up, but in medical school they did. And so for a number of the standardized exams I took, I did end up needing those accommodations. And so this just goes back to the idea that the need for accommodations can fluctuate, and just keep that in mind. We haven't talked about this, but if someone develops a need for accommodations and their test day is looming, you're probably going to want to change your test day and push your test day back, because oftentimes the benefit of accommodations will outweigh the stress and the need to extend, and I should say push back your test day. And so just if this is something that comes up later, it's worth pushing your test day back to get those accommodations. In more cases than not.
That's something that's less of a problem right now, because we're not like in the midst of the application season, which is honestly why we should be talking about it, so people can kind of like see ahead to like what might be coming down the line. But like during like the spring or summer, a lot of people are like, I'm trying to apply this year, and like all of a sudden things get a little bit trickier. But like you want to, like if you push back, all of a sudden you have to delay a year of your life before you go to med school. And so that can be a little bit more problematic. Definitely, like this is the sort of thing like a person by person basis is really important, and do communicate with the accommodations department. Do not just like, oh, I submitted my form, I'm done. I have a student that like talked to the accommodations department 3 times a week for the last couple of weeks, because they were like just trying to make sure that everything was kind of getting taken care of. And I know that sounds terrible, but like, we'll talk about the timelines a little bit more. here in a little bit, but sometimes you need to be that, once again, that squeaky wheel, and it falls on you to be the one doing this. Should you have to call them 3 times a week? No. But
not at all.
But if it's not, things aren't happening like the way that they should, you may need to be the one kind of driving that forward. I do want to kind of pause and emphasize, because that was something you mentioned kind of in passing. This is another thing, is like, if you have physical conditions or psychological conditions or something, and you feel like, oh, like it won't impact the MCAT, and so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Like, you should still probably reach out to the accommodations department, because even though the test has 0 hearing components, they want you to reach out if you're going to be wearing a hearing aid. If you are diabetic and you're wearing an insulin pump, like, you may want to reach out, because it's like that insulin pump, you can't just take it off and like not wear that during the test. And so there are some things that, like, they need to be aware of your medical needs, even if it doesn't impact the MCAT, just because of the security side of things. Yeah. And so that is useful to kind of like go in there. I do want to say, and you mentioned this as well, like, there's multiple ways they can kind of accommodate things. I actually went to med school with somebody who was clinically blind. They had some visual stuff, but like it was their vision was bad enough that like they could not get a driver's license, and they could not, like, they were functionally blind according to the medical field. But like in medical school, like, they could still see enough, but like they couldn't look at like a computer screen or even a book, because the writing was too small. And so like they would make accommodations where they had like this, essentially like a book microscope, where you would take the book and set it on here, and it would blow up the screen on like a TV, so they could kind of like read the book going through there. And there can be like some similar things with the AAMC on like what accommodations they can do. And so like, you can have like a scenario where if you are completely physically blind and you cannot see anything, then maybe they can do some accommodations with Braille or something like that. But you want to reach out to those testing centers. Yeah. If it's just like, I have trouble seeing, and you're like, oh, once again, I really want to reiterate, communicate with the AAMC, because there might be students that like, oh, I'll just do the test, and if I need to like make the screen bigger, I'll like enhance like the Control Plus or Command Plus on your computer that you use to make the images larger. A lot of functionality of those computers at the AAMC do not work because they of the security side of things, and so like these computers have stripped away a lot of functionality. So I don't think you can just like enhance or enlarge something or change the size of it. I think that that's something that is like disabled in the computers themselves. And so you really want to be communicating with these. Don't just like plan and hope like, oh, this should work. On the AMC website, I remember seeing that text enlargement is an accommodation. And I don't recall seeing the ability to change it on the exam. So definitely something to think about. And again, it's really easy to think, well, I can manage, right? You do not want to have to manage and push through something on test day if there are accommodations that you can get, right? So something that I really want to make sure we emphasize. Especially because this process is very hard and very competitive, and to not get accommodations for that is to like tie your hands behind your back. And like, I'm going to compete against everyone else who doesn't have this thing kind of holding them back. And it is a difficult enough process that you do not want to be held back because of anything, especially if you can avoid it. And it is avoidable. And that's why it's kind of important to kind of like talk through those things. And a super long exam. Like, let's not forget, it is a very long exam. Super quick. Even if you don't have like any seeing difficulties, I strongly recommend every so often looking away from the computer screen and looking into, can't really look into the distance, but like at the wall. Because it can produce a lot of eye strain. And for those of us that wear glasses or contacts, can definitely be the case. So just kind of think about that. And as someone who is personally prone to migraines and have had students who are prone to headaches in general, you can take something ahead of time, right? Or just making sure that you are doing everything in your power to
minimize the chances of having a migraine on test day, making sure you're eating well or hydrated beforehand, get enough sleep. So just want to throw that out there as well.
I do want to be, and I know that nobody thinks this probably, but just to be careful, like when you say look away from the screen, like we don't mean look at like your neighbors, things like that. but like just let your eyes kind of go into the distance, like you are looking at something far away, not like, oh, I'm going to look around the room. Like that might get you flagged a little bit. And like you may have some problems if you start to
100%
look at people's screens.
The good thing is they have the blinders. So you could look at the corner of the blinder, something to keep in mind. But yes, we do not want you to get your test voided on testing.
Yeah. There are some other things, anxiety, depression. Like I know that those seems like things that like you wouldn't need, like especially maybe depression. Depression is infamous, and like people who have depression are less likely to go like see somebody because you're depressed, and that means you are less generally like the driving force to get you up and going is a bigger barrier. But anxiety that can go into this. I've had students who have had panic attacks during the exam, and that like does not help their score. I am telling you now. And so like having some like being able to adapt there. Breastfeeding, I know that seems like, wait, why would the AMC need to know that? And like, I can kind of get why you would see like, okay, I feel like I don't need to do that. But if you need to pump or if you need to feed your kid, like the AMC wants to make accommodations for this, right? Like somebody shouldn't be held from being a physician because they're a parent. Like that's not like, we don't want that in the medical community. We don't want to like generally, people who are parents, they're probably going to be better pediatricians because they understand what it's like to be a parent. And so we don't want to be like, okay, no doctors can be parents. And so like accommodations there are important, and we want to kind of adapt to those as well.
Yeah. And really quick on the depression aspect of things. One of the criteria or one of the things that we ask about when we're diagnosing someone with depression is their ability to concentrate. To stay focused and the effect on cognition. And so if that, you can imagine that if that's one of the things that we ask about when diagnosing someone, that it can have a significant impact. And on the note of PTSD, one of the most heartbreaking experiences I had with a student was someone who had made so much progress on their practice exams, and life happened in a terribly horrible way in I think it was like month and a half, 2 months leading up to test day. And we'd had conversations about, is this really the best time, getting professional help involved? And they just wanted to test and get it over with. And this is part of why I really want to emphasize that people, if life happens, it's better to push your exam than to test when you need help. And they had their very first panic attack on their test day and scored the absolute lowest that we had ever seen, even before, even lower than what they'd started at. And it was heartbreaking because they should have been a super competitive MCAT score applicant. And so you don't want to end up in that situation on test day. Please, as life happens, it's better, almost guaranteed, to push your test day and get the support, the accommodations, than to not. And to get that professional help if you need it, than to not. Just want to make that abundantly clear. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very, very big thing.
So some of the other things that, you could end up getting accommodations for, we've talked about some things that are temporary or can be temporary, like traumatic brain injuries and concussions and those effects. I'm really curious. I haven't seen the AMC say anything about long COVID. It's something that we're still figuring out why it happens. People have such very different degrees of impact, how long it lasts. It might be something that if it's having a very significant impact, to try and get accommodations for, especially if you have the documentation to support it. Just want to throw that out there. But for things like diabetes, you might want to reach out, right? Like you pointed out, if you have a combo of the continuous glucose monitor and a pump, you want to let them know they're going to have to, just do a quick check. Same with Same that they do with glasses, with hearing aids when you go in and out. And so you don't want to have any trouble on test day with that. Other chronic conditions like Crohn's disease are something that the AMC can help with accommodations for. You can imagine that stress causing a Crohn's flare can have a pretty big impact on how you test and your ability to be fully engaged with the exam. And so even if you're thinking, okay, well, historically, things have mostly been okay. If you've had a history of when you take an exam, you get a flare, things get out of hand, worth applying for accommodations. Things where, or situations where people have chronic pain conditions that would limit their ability to sit through the exam, those prolonged periods of time, or, may need to split it up. You can imagine that the AMC would provide accommodations for that. I had a patient, and this is not specific to the AMC and the MCAT, but I had an older patient who'd had a complex, like regional pain syndrome for many years, and their ability to sit even through an exam or to participate in a physical exam was very limited and difficult. And so don't underestimate the impact that can have. And again, it's much better to try and get accommodations than to push through something and have that impact your ability to do your best on test day.
Especially with chronic pain, kind of overall, a lot of people kind of learn to just deal with it and just kind of like push through, because it's like chronic is all the time. I feel like I'm sharing a lot about me personally, but I had a back injury in when I was in football in high school, and like this has caused like it's not constant, but every once in a while it'll be like, oh, for 2 or 3 months I'm just having this pretty intense pain, and like sitting for too long or standing for too long, like there's no right position for me. It just like I can't be in the one position for too long, otherwise all of a sudden I like have trouble getting out of bed, like physically, like just getting up out from a laying position. And that's something that like I just kind of like learned to deal with throughout my everyday life. But taking the MCAT, all of a sudden sitting for 7.5 hours, like that, like you're going to be asked to do stuff on the MCAT that might be harder and more difficult than what it is in your daily life.
Yeah.
And so understand that even though you feel like you can handle this in your daily life, and like nobody wants to admit that they need help. And so there's also something with that. And so people kind of have this like, oh, well, it's fine. Like I'll just kind of deal with it. But it is kind of sometimes amazing. Like, so me personally, like when there are times when my back pain has been so bad and I take a pain medication and I didn't realize how much it was affecting me until like all of a sudden the next day I take my pain med. I'm like, I am thinking so much clearer than I was yesterday. And like, it is so much easier for me to get so much more stuff done, and not get exhausted and just kind of like tired. And so the idea of like being in that position where I was in pain, but also trying to take a test would be a very difficult proposition. But I also know myself well enough to know that back when I took the MCAT, I would probably have been a stickler and said like, no, I don't need it. I'm fine. Like, leave me alone. But like, I actually like it probably, luckily I didn't have like that kind of back pain flare up during the MCAT. Otherwise, I think it probably would have impacted me severely.
Phil, the amount of parallel experiences that we have had is truly kind of wild. The more I think about it, I injured my back in med school, helping, during a patient's birthing process where I was not taught or explained how to help. And their very long, prolonged hours of labor can do a number on a number of things.
Yes.
And there was a time where I think it was maybe a month or two later, I was sitting in my peds clinic and I was in so much pain trying to sit through a virtual visit that I actually started crying, and I hadn't talked to anyone about this. And after the visit, the attending that I was working with looked at me and he said, you need to see someone. I would rather you not show up and use that time to get the help you need than to be here. Like it's more important for you to take care of yourself. And I had been dealing with that for a long time at that point. And like you was had some trouble getting some help. And so this is part of why I'm a very big proponent of speak up even when you think you can handle things. It's important to get things taken care of.
Yeah. I do also want to mention, unlike the insulin pump and that sort of stuff, like technically the AAMC says that you don't need, like wearing an insulin pump bed is something that you shouldn't need prior approval for. But this is also, I feel like, something that has come with age. Like, once again, I feel like when I was younger, I'm like, okay, I assume everyone is going to be doing a great job kind of all the time in all of their positions and everywhere that I go, because that's how I would kind of want to be doing things. But as I've gotten older, I've learned that, like, okay, like sometimes things fall through the cracks. And like when somebody's working a job, like I should be caring about this, but I don't have the time or the bandwidth or the resources to actually be able to do all of those things. So it doesn't mean that the people doing the job are not like competent or things like that, but often like the demands are too extreme that like you can't be perfectly competent because it's just impossible. That may or may not be a discussion on the medical field and some parts of it. But I would still want to communicate, like even if the AMC says an insulin pump is okay, I would still want to just like reach out and make sure they know I'm going to have an insulin pump so that they don't have an employee there who like maybe hasn't read the handbook closely enough and they see like you're wearing a device, you can't go in. And so just as this, you know, kind of like making sure that they're aware that these things are happening before it happens. That is also something that I would have been very terrible at. Kind of like, just like, oh, it says it's fine, so it'll be fine, and I'll just go. And like, no, actually, like this, like, just reach out, make a phone call, being like, hey, I have an insulin pump. Just want to like make sure everyone knows. And like, they're like, okay, sounds good. And 9 times out of 10, it might not have been a problem, but like, you don't really want to gamble on that one time being the problem when you go take your test. Yeah, there's also like other things like wheelchair, like being in a wheelchair or having a broken leg or like having something that kind of interferes with like the physical containment of like being able to sit at the desk even like can be a problem. Or just the things like the back pain stuff. Like if I would have been having a flare up, what would have helped me is the ability to like stand up for a little bit and then kind of like sit back down. And the MCAT does give like stop the clock breaks where you can just kind of like pause the clock, but I don't think they would have let me just stand up and walk around in the testing room with a bunch of other people in there. I know that the AAMC does allow like students sometimes to take exams kind of in their own room, like kind of like off in their own little isolated thing. And like that would have worked perfectly if that was a scenario that I had been in, where if I could like pause the clock for just like 5 minutes or like 2 minutes, just get up and like walk around for a moment. And that would have like kind of eased all of that. But once again, kind of going in and making sure that you're communicating those things. The broken leg thing, like temporary injuries, that's also something that can be a little bit hard because, like, what if I break my leg like a month before the test, right? Yeah. And like if the application process takes months to go through there, like I might not be able to get that accommodations. Once again, you want to be a really squeaky wheel and call and like be like, I got x-rays, like here's my leg, send a picture, like I'm in a cast, like I'm going to need maybe some kind of accommodations here. The AMC will maybe be able to kind of like fast track those things if it's something that's like, oh, this isn't something I wasn't planning on having 2 broken legs. This happened all of a sudden. This is as much a surprise to me as it is to you. And like that, just kind of like making sure that you're kind of like reaching out is important. Kind of even in those things that are more temporary or like surprising, like concussions or a broken leg or I'm having a like back pain that I've never had before because I was helping somebody during labor. Side note, there's a lot of things like in the medical field, like it can be physically hard on physicians, like long surgeries and things like that. Luckily, we're a lot better at it now. My best friend is a pathologist, and he talks about how like all of the older pathologists all have neck problems, and it's just because they're all like over the microscopes. And now the new microscopes, like you can sit upright or project it onto a screen, and like so there's like way less problems in the field, just because of the ramifications of the job.
Side note: when I was in the preclinical phase of med school, we had, we went through some pathology and whatnot. And because obviously they couldn't have a bunch of us looking at the same slide at the same time with a microscope, they had that where it was projected and we were able to see at the same time. And it was really cool. They also, had versions online that we could navigate, scroll through, zoom in, things like that. But it's really cool. So
it is very cool. Like I said, my friend's a pathologist. And so the field, like being able to do that allows all of a sudden telepathology, where like pathologists in like other cities, like you could just project the image in another place. And like, so if it's some rare cancer that like, there's nobody in this city who's ever seen a cancer like this. Well, there's this guy over here who's kind of familiar with it and specialized with it. Let's send it to him and see what's going on there.
With things like being in a wheelchair, they can help with adjustable workstations and desks, because you've got to keep in mind, right, the clearance, the space between the wheelchair and the desk. And so even if you're like, oh, normally I'm fine, find out what the clearance would be and how high the desks are, and make sure that would actually work. And if not, time to reach out to the AMC.
And once again, like if it's either, you might be like, oh, it's fine. Like I do work at my desk from a wheelchair all the time and it doesn't like adjust or things like that. And maybe it would be fine on test day if it was like 20 minutes, but it's 7.5 hours. And so like it may be hard for you to like lean forward and be in this weird position. And you're going to have that back pain that we were talking about before because you tried to push yourself with something that you didn't need to. Yeah.
They also can help with the mouse, which I found really interesting and would really love as someone with really bad carpal tunnel in both wrists. I have one of those ergonomic mouses. Yeah,
mouses. Like, yeah.
I don't know what the plural of a computer mouse is. But we did not give an exhaustive list of things that might qualify for accommodations. So if you think you need accommodations, reach out.
I feel like that carpal tunnel thing would be another kind of like classic. Yeah, reach out. Like that's a sort of thing that like using a computer for, an entire day might be a difficult thing, even if it's not like really intricate movements. Like a lot of times computer stuff is what causes the carpal tunnel.
Yep. Had it in undergrad. That's actually where I developed it, and it got really bad. And to the point where I ended up getting surgery within the first few months of med school because it was just so intense. Side note, surgery may or may not happen. So something to keep in mind with carpal tunnel release. In any case, we did talk about stop the clock breaks. You can get extended time. So sometimes they do time and a half. Sometimes they do 25% time, so 1.25 time. I have personally heard more students get 1.25, 25% more time, even when they have typically gotten time and a half or 50% more time. And that can be really frustrating. So don't assume that you're going to get the same time that you have historically gotten. And this impacts the locations that are able to meet your accommodations, as well as how many days it takes to take the exam, because there will be instances where that means your exam gets split into 2 days. Because you can imagine a roughly 12-hour exam or 7.5 plus halftime is too much. And so they will split your exam over 2 days, and not every test center can accommodate that. And not every test day will work. And so it becomes really important to think about that when you consider the application process and how getting the testing date set after you've received accommodations can play out. And I know we're going to be chatting about timelines.
Yeah. And I feel like timelines, maybe we should have started with this just because there's so much stuff going on with that.
Yeah.
But and so like this understanding of like not every testing center will accommodate every issue. That's also why you really need to be looking kind of ahead of the time. Like there are places that like don't have an extra room. Like, so if you get qualified for an extra room to like go take your test in, then you're not going to be able to test at this center. Or maybe you can test at this center, but only on this day, because that other day, somebody else is scheduled to use that room. That I know that I mentioned a student that like had to reach out like 3 times a week. This is a student that had been approved for accommodations. They're approved. They have accommodations. But they could not get a test site in here. So they're trying to schedule their test, which is just like, like a couple months away at this point. which I know sounds like, oh, that's plenty of time. But like this is confusing. Like a lot of times, like entire cities had their testing centers for all of January were gone within an hour, based on the when the registration opened recently. And so like waiting a couple of months and then trying to find a test center, like that's like they're going to be filled. It's going to be hard to do. And so this student had to reach out, and they were just repeatedly told, like, this city, we're trying this city. No, they don't have anything. This city, like they can't make accommodations here at this city. And so all of a sudden, like they're in a scenario where they're like, oh, there's one in this state that's like mini, like it's going to be a flight to go take this. And like that, if you can avoid that, you always want to as well. And so that's why this student, like, they just kept getting put on hold and like, yeah, we'll look back and maybe get back to you. And then like, we'll look back and get back to you. And it's just like, okay, I'm like, listen, I really want to know that I have a test date and a center and these accommodations that you've said I deserve. And like, I kind of like just to even the playing field, that I can actually get these. I do also want to mention that like splitting over 2 days, I think pretty much every case I've seen where someone gets extra time, the exam gets split over 2 days. I actually think this isn't like an intended benefit, but I actually think that makes test day a little bit easier, where you just know, and like today's just chemistry and cars. Like, that's all I got to worry about for this. And the next day is like bio and psych. And that makes life a little bit easier overall. And so a lot of times students like really enjoy that. But also, side note, this is why you want to be like ahead of time with the accommodation stuff, because all the practice tests you take, you should be taking them with similar accommodations to what you're doing. So if your test is going to be split over 2 days, or you think your test is going to be split over 2 days, but you're really slow, like getting accommodations, you may find out like 3 weeks before the test, they're like, oh, you're not getting that.
Yeah.
And so all the practice tests you've been doing are not under the conditions of your actual test. And that's something you want to make sure that you know what your testing conditions are going to be like a couple of months before your actual test date, so that you can make sure that you're emulating your test conditions under all those practice ways.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but especially in a recent episode talking about an ideal timeline. The last month and a half, you should be doing full length exams, right? As of the time of the release of this episode, there are 6 full length exams that the AMC has put out. You should aim to do all of them. And so even though some are more outdated than others, but that means that you want to have, like you pointed out, for sure, know what your accommodations may or may not be a month and a half ahead of time. And we're going to chat about timelines in a second. It is safer to err on the side of, if you have to practice without knowing, practice assuming that you won't get any. And it's unfortunate, but it's a safer bet than us practicing assuming that you will.
Yeah.
So timeline becomes really important. And to your point, we probably should have started with it in retrospect. So the AMC says that it can take up to 60 days to review your application. And like we said, that is not including the time for you to see your physician, to get an appointment, to have any evaluations that may be needed done. So keep that in mind.
And they need a hard paper trail on that. So like saying like, I'm going to get a letter from my therapist or a counselor, like that probably is not going to work.
Oh, yeah. So I would say start months ahead of the 60-day start time, in terms of considering what it might be. Now, that's assuming that you get the accommodations you think you need and that you do not need to appeal. That assumes that your application is marked as complete. It may not be. If your application is marked as incomplete, it is another 60 days to they consider essentially a new application when you give the complete application.
After you update like the stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that becomes 4 months. So please make sure that you are giving them everything they want so that your application does not get marked as incomplete.
Yeah.
Now, let's say that you're in a situation where you get accommodations and you're like, this is not what I need, or you don't get accommodations, you get some new information and you're like, hey, please reconsider. That's another 30 days in addition to the original 60 days. So that is now a 3-month process. So you can see where 3 months to 4 months may be what it takes to get accommodations,
Yeah.
if not longer, because you may need to wait between the original decision and an appeal because you need more information. Or if it's marked incomplete and you need more information, it will then take more than 4 months because there's additional time in between the application and the appeal or the resubmission that you need to get things done.
Yeah.
And so it really is the earlier that you start the process, even if you're planning on testing in June, start now, right? It will be to your benefit. And if you got accommodations more than 5 years ago, you need to resubmit a new application. If it's an extension earlier than that, then they estimate that it will take about 30 days, but still something to keep in mind.
Yeah. This is something that like I've had students have multiple like things come up. And so like in theory, like if all of those bad things happened to one student, like, oh, I applied because I have a visual impairment. And it takes them let's say not the full 60 days. Let's say it takes them 45 days to get back to you. And they're like, oh, actually, your application is missing a letter from an optometrist. We know you have a letter from your physician, but we need it specifically from somebody who specializes in eyes. Okay. And so you're like, okay, fine. So I need to go and like, oh, I actually can't get an appointment with an optometrist or ophthalmologist unless I get a recommendation from my physician. So I need to set an appointment to meet with my physician. Yep. And that may take a couple of weeks. And then they give you the referral. And then that takes a couple of weeks before that appointment. And so that may add another month. And then you finally get that letter and you submit it and you resubmit your application. Well, now you've got another 2 months before you go through this. And so this may be like 5 months. And then they could say no. And sometimes that happens. And then you may need to appeal. I know I mentioned this before, a student who submitted everything. They got rejected for accommodations. They appealed it and they weren't asked for any more documentation. And they're like, okay, yeah, you're right. You should get accommodations. And like nothing changed on the application. But they just kind of allowed that. And so I've had multiple scenarios where students have had to kind of like go through this. And we want to reiterate that you want to kind of know what your accommodations are going to be before you're taking practice tests. So if that path takes like 4 or 5 months, like you want that to be done like 2 months before your test date. And so I'm painting a very grim picture here. And this is what happens if everything goes wrong in this process. And it's not always going to go wrong. Like all of those things are probably not all going to happen to the same student, but I have had students that all of those things have happened to. And so planning on like it taking an extra month or 2 and like having that wiggle room, you may not need it, but you may need it. And just being aware of that. And so whenever I have a student, like if I'm meeting with them for tutoring and I'm like, oh, like, do you have any accommodations or anything like that? They're like, well, I think I should be able to get, I'm like, okay, you got to get on that now. Like before homework, before you're working on anything else, this is your number one priority is start getting that stuff submitted because it may end up completely, like you may end up in trouble if you don't get those accommodations approved early.
Yeah. And the AMC on their website has suggested submission dates for an initial application. And that kind of allows for that buffer of, appeals, reconsiderations, extensions. So for folks that are testing March 9th, and that, we have a lot of folks that are testing in January. So
March 9th and later, not just March 9th, but also like June and things like that.
Yeah. So the March 9th specific kind of last recommended date, and you don't want to, again, this is like assuming a good case. And so we recommend an even larger buffer period. But they say really by November 25th, you want to have that application in. And again, we recommend a larger buffer. Give yourself more time if at all possible. But if you're listening to this and you already signed up for that March 9th test date, start as soon as you can, assuming, let's say that you have 30 minutes of extra time after you listen to this podcast today, time to start figuring out what you need to submit that application. The dates that they give you are assuming things go generally speaking well, and that does not include the time to get your appointments. On that note, insurances can be difficult to manage. So there are going to be some insurances that, people might have that don't require referrals. There will be some that do. Find out what your insurance requires. call the member services on that number is listed on the back of your insurance card. Find out what types of tests they will cover, even if you don't need a referral to see that specialist. You probably need a referral from the specialist for exams, certain testing.
Yeah.
And so, there are going to be things that get that. And even then, the AMC is going to require something from a specialist in terms of a letter. So find out. Insurances can be tough to navigate.
Yeah.
Find out what your insurance covers. Find out what kind of referrals you would need.
That's also something that I've seen with students where they're like, my insurance covers like one exam a year for this thing. And like, I got an exam, but it wasn't from the specialist.
Yeah.
And so like now I need it from the specialist, but my insurance won't cover it. And so now I have to pay out of pocket like hundreds of dollars, if not $1,000 or something like that for like going through this. And that is one more thing we want to kind of like reiterate, the fee assistance program. Like the AAMC will help out with that. If you qualify for fee assistance, they don't want to be like, well, we require all these things for accommodations, but like, we also know that you can't afford it. Like they don't want to be that evildoer there. And so they can kind of give some things. I would definitely say look into the system. I can't remember if they pay, like you have to get that fee assistance for that reevaluation before, or if they'll reimburse you after. You definitely want to look into the AAMC stuff.
Yeah.
For that.
And super quick, the AMC, through a partnership with a group in Canada, also has a similar program in terms of the general fee assistance program for folks in Canada. So take a look at that. If you have already signed up for a test day and you are in the process of signing up for the fee assistance program, or sign up for it afterwards, after listening to this, it is not retrospective in that you will not get money back for the money that you spent on signing up for the exam. So keep that in mind, but it is still worth applying because you can get practice resources and some help with the actual application process, and some waivers on fees for that. Yeah. So
the assistance thing in Canada is, first off, it's really great. Love that they're doing it. It was not always that case, but it has also changed significantly in the last year. And so if you were looking at that over the summer, like relook at it now, because it seems like the system has changed for that. And so you want to make sure that you are up to date on what sort of things they will pay for. And it seems like generally more, which is good, which makes life. That's once again how the system should be.
Yeah. So we've thrown a ton of information at our listeners and at you guys, but hopefully this was helpful. If you know someone that might benefit from listening to this podcast episode, share it, right? Yeah. Sometimes folks, know that their friends are struggling with something and are having trouble reaching out for help. Reach out for that help. We want to make sure that you are performing your absolute best on test day. We didn't talk about this, but knowing when to test is really important. We talked about that in a prior episode. Something to keep in mind in deciding a test day is really important, not just when it comes to the accommodations process, but just where you're at in terms of content, classes that you've taken, whatever your diagnostic tests show when you're deciding, to study for the MCAT. So something to keep in mind, deciding when to test is a big deal. And so keep that in the back of your mind as well.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys have, at the very least, learned a little bit more about the accommodations process. I feel like there's a lot of students I have that like would qualify for accommodations, but they just don't feel like they need it, or like they don't kind of want to. I definitely encourage those people to do it. There's no shame in that. But also, like, you may have things that you feel like are not going to impact test day, but you should still let the AMC know some of those things. And so hopefully we've kind of like clarified, and if nothing else, kind of lit a fire. Like, if you have not started working on this, you should be working on it. But yeah.
And if you would like some help figuring out what your test day should be, or what resources you should be using, feel free to reach out to the Jack Westin Academic Advisors. Meeting with them is free, and they can help you figure out what makes sense for you as an individual and make recommendations. And we will make sure to include that link in the description, as well as the link for the AAMC's recommendations for when you should be applying for accommodations by.